Okay, where were we? Job number... Nah, I don't want to start off that way. I think we were talking about a smashed bunny float. We were talking about the scoop, smashed bunny floats, and also writing. Thinking about writing. At this point in my life, I was writing for the school newspaper. I was the feature editor of the school newspaper. And I wrote crazy stories like the smashed bunny float, as mentioned. Also, another headline of mine was, Narc Gets Digits Nipped. And these weren't really journalistic stories or even feature stories. They're just kind of like me writing weird stuff. And I was the feature editor, so no one's going to say no. I had a column called The Unreal Facts, where I would just like randomly write weird things, which leads us to this week's job number 7, newspaper columnist. And I'm not talking about a newspaper columnist for the school newspaper. That I did not get money for. I did not get paid for that. Because again, I was writing Smash Bunny Floats and Narc Gets Digits Nips. That wasn't even gonzo journalism. That wasn't even, Hunter S. Thompson, level. It was just kind of strange weirdness. And my stories had a tendency to be kind of like this little humor mixed with strange violence. I think I was highly influenced by Stephen King and Woody Allen. Narc Gets Digits Nipped later became a short film I made called Finger Pressure. I did write a review of U2's first album for the school newspaper, and that was a true feature article. There were lots of fellow students who were like really doing journalism. I don't know what I was doing, which made this next suggestion of my father's quite strange. My dad comes to me and he says, you should write a column for the local paper. Paper. You should write a column for the Pope. You should write paper, popple. Paper, popple, people, paper. People, popple, paper. People, popple. I got plenty of time. So my dad, reading these strange stories, I don't know where he made this leap, but he said, you know what, you should write a newspaper column for the local paper, the Gridley Herald. Again, this is crazy talk. This is like your dad coming to you and saying, I think you should join the circus. Or, I don't think you're spending enough time playing video games, which is another sidelight altogether about my dad and video games. We needed a washing machine pretty bad, and they cost $400. So my dad went to Sears and came home with a $400 Atari video game console. That was my dad. It's like, we can do dishes anytime. This is brand new Atari video games, and it's got 240 games. He bought that and said, I think my mom was she was pretty ticked about that. Not ticked, because she knew him. Anyway. So my dad, he was a bit of a loose cannon. Work at the Scoop, write for the Gridley Herald. And the Gridley Herald, it was quintessential small-town newspaper. It was run by a guy named Bill Burleson. And this guy was almost a stereotype of a small-town newspaper guy. He was a big, heavy guy, big glasses. I think maybe he smoked a cigar. I don't know why I want to say that, and he drove a big Cadillac. And his claim to fame was he once, in this transition phase between self-serve, completely self-serve, and, gas stations we're talking about here, self-serve gas and, full-serve gas, there was that transition period where like, what are we supposed to do? And you could do one or the other. Well, he got out there and he put the gas in and then forgot that oh man, I'm blowing this story. Bill Burleson, who was the publisher of the Gridley Herald, was famous for, there's only one good way to say this, and that's he was famous for one time he left the gas nozzle. What is that thing called? I can't think of what anything's called. Last week it was grill. That's that hunk of metal over flame. It's called the grill. This one is the gas nozzle. What's it, the handle? The gas engagement device. The thing that you stick in your car to put the gas in. Anyway, he stuck that in his car, and he left it in, and he drove off. And he yanked the tube right out of the gas receptacle. I can't think of anything. Gas. You see them all the time. Pump. The gas pump. The hose gets ripped out of the pump, and he's driving down the street. No problem, except he's got this gas thing trailing after him. He had on the front page of every newspaper, the newspaper that came out on, I want to say, Tuesdays and Fridays, he would have his own column called the Pie-Line. I think it was called the Pie-Line or the Byline. He used the royal we. which that's pretty gutsy. Or also, I'm in a small town, I own the newspaper, I can do whatever I want. So he used the royal we, like, we went, when we were getting gas today, we forgot to put the nozzle back into the pump. And, he would use that we, and I was like, when I was a kid, I'm like, who's this we that they keep talking about? And my mom had to explain what the royal we was. And my dog just walked in. And what are you doing? He's on the prowl, he's gonna make noise. And I got a cat right there, I got a dog right there. So that's Bill Burleson. So I go to pitch it. I didn't pitch my idea of writing a newspaper column to Bill Burleson because he was kind of off limits. Everyone knew who he was. He was kind of a larger-than-life character with larger-than-life opinions, as you would if you're the publisher of a small-town newspaper and you're like the last word on whatever it is in the town. It was like the Old West with that, I am way off tangent. I was a newspaper columnist. I pitched my idea to the editor. I can't remember the editor's name. And he said, sure, that sounds great. So here I am, 16 years old, and I've got my own newspaper column in the local paper. It was called The Weekender. And once a week, I would write about things that you could do if you're a teenager in town. And the format of these stories was usually something like a teenager tries to go do something, is thwarted by something, and then has to go do something else. And so it's basically this teenager who's bopping around all these different events. And that way I'd get all these press releases, or I'd look at the movies like what was shown at the midnight movies, and I would be able to put those all into the thing. And this frustrated teenager would be hopping around to these things. I don't really remember too many of the stories. The one I do remember is the one that they rejected. I remember two stories, actually. One they rejected, and one, it was the 4th of July. And I thought, it'll be funny, and I'll do a play on words when I talk about things that are happening during the 4th of July. I'll call everybody everyone who participates in these kind of things, I'll call them celibates. And there's kind of a pun on celebration, and you're a celibate. Like the celibates went to the Little League game, or the celibates went to the 4th of July pie eating contest. And I thought that was hilarious, because celibates, I don't know, I thought it was funny. They didn't think it was funny. Either that, and maybe it's not that funny. It's probably not that funny, because the puns are never funny. But anyway, they misinterpreted. They didn't get the joke at all, and they thought that I just did a typo and didn't know the proper word, and they changed the word to celebrants. Brents with the celebrants, which then just became this, it was weird. It wasn't funny, but the celebrants. The other one that they rejected outright was I had the teens would go around to these different events, but there were these killer vampire squirrels that would go and suck the blood out of people at these different events. And so they would have to go to a different event, even though they had the blood sucked out of them. Oh, that's right. I think in that one, the protagonist was the killer vampire squirrel. And they would go around to the different events and feed on people. Because I think my audience was killer vampire squirrels, and they needed to know where the next new event was. I would turn that thing in once a week, triple space. I would write it on my Olivetti typewriter, type that thing out. Would I read it over? Maybe. It was full of typos. I'm sure it was full of typos and bad grammar. But that's what editors are for. They would change words like celibates to celebrants. If you're wondering what kind of newspaper lets a 16-year-old run rampant on their pages, well, it was a small-town newspaper. And I think one of the reasons that my dad was able to say, hey, why don't you write for the newspaper, was because he had a worldview perspective on that's a small-town newspaper and you can probably get away with it. Whereas for me, being from a small town, that was the paper. Bill Burleson was famous. I mean, people in the paper, that was a big deal. It was like New York Times, Gridley Herald, same thing. The Gridley Herald also had its share of, what's the word I'm looking for? Typos? I mean, for example, Leslie Denise, she was an athlete in our hometown. She went on to win the silver medal in discus, I believe. I think it was discus in the 1984 Olympics. She won the silver medal. This is a big deal for a small town. And when she was in high school, she would travel around. They had this big article about her, how she was going to Russia. She, was on this big whirlwind tour of all these different events, and she's going to Russia. And in the headline, they wrote, El Denise returns home, leaves for Russia tomorrow. That's right, Russia. Here it is right here. I had to look it up to make sure didn't have a faulty member. El Denise leaves home, leaves for Russia today. Returns home. Gridley Herald misspelled Russia, left out the I. Actually, while I was researching this, I found out that the person that Leslie Denise, lost to the gold to in the 84 Olympics just admitted to using steroids. It's just this year. I wouldn't have known that had I not been researching this for this project. So she probably should have had the gold medal. I got paid for this job being a newspaper columnist. I got paid $30 a column. Now, just a few short years before, that's 2.5 days pay for me just for sitting down at the typewriter and making up some stuff, looking at a press release, writing in some dates. That's good money. Plus, it tapped into my 2 motivating things in life, which I am embarrassed to say. But the things, the 2 things, you know how people are motivated by certain things like money or power or fame or prestige or status. Doing a little soul searching in my life, in the course of my life, I've discovered that the things that motivate me are 2 things: fun and praise. And here I was as a newspaper columnist. It was fun and people would praise me. I liked your article in the paper. That was hilarious. That was funny about the thing, this, and that. And I got money for it, $30. That's 2.5 days of farm work back then for me. This was great. I loved it. Seeing your name in print, boy, that is heady stuff. That gets into your skin. You'd open that newspaper like, oh boy, there it is. People would literally talk about some of my columns for years later. Like, oh, remember that one that you did in the such and such that week? I love that column. People look forward to reading it. I don't think anyone ever looked at my column, The Weekender, and thought, you know what? I think I'm going to go see the midnight movie of Led Zeppelin's Song Remains the Same because The Weekender suggested it. I don't think anyone did anything I ever suggested ever. It wasn't like I had people clamoring, could you mention our event in your column because we know that we'll get a big bump in attendance if they read it in The Weekender. None of that was going on. One final story about being a newspaper columnist. I had to actually hand deliver the typewritten pages to the paper. Now this email, rigmarole back then, it wouldn't even have occurred to me. It wouldn't even have been a thought, which is like strangely science fiction-y. Anyway, so I had to type this thing up. I typed it up triple space, and it was like 3 or 4 pages long, maybe 4 or 5 pages, because triple space takes up a lot of room. And so I get on my motorcycle, and no helmet, and I'm wearing Birkenstocks, so my feet are exposed, and I've got this in one hand, and I had an automatic ST90, Honda ST90. If you want to see a cool-looking motorcycle, look up that Honda ST90. So I've got it in one hand, automatic, and I'm driving with the other hand because I didn't want to wrinkle up these pages. Don't wrinkle up your column pages because you got to turn them in. They got to look good. And I'm coming around the first turn, and I hit an oil slick, and boom, I slide out. No helmet, basically bare feet at this point because my Birkenstocks fly off, and I go skidding across the road, and there's a guy mowing his lawn. And he stops, and he looks over at me, and I'm like laid out. My jeans are all torn up. My feet are just like raw, and he comes over and looks at me and goes, oh, looks like you got a little bit of a raspberry. And then he turns around and goes back to mowing his lawn. And I get on my motorcycle, bleeding, but the pristine pages were still intact and handed in my newspaper column. And I never missed a deadline. So, job number 7, newspaper columnist. Thanks for watching. Tell your friends. Subscribe if you can. I don't know how you subscribe. You just hit that button, subscribe. It's somewhere around here. I think there's a picture of me holding a donkey. One of them, a newspaper columnist. Small town newspapers with that local slant, they still are thriving. I mean, they're bought up by big corporations who have this big umbrella and they run these individual ones. Anyway, thanks for watching. We'll see you next week at 52 on 52 at 52. Oh, still talk too long. I'm going to cut that thing down, though. You guys were not very well behaved.